fall down, I just gotta get up, hey.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everybody. This is actually a special edition of the Tom Ficklin Radio Show, and Yarrow Dunham is with us. Yarrow is the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale, and actually, Yarrow, this is, I think your third time of being baptized and misted and sprinkled and submerged and smudged and whatever the case, whatever ritual you follow. But I'm really glad we can do this show today. I mean, any time to do the show would have been good, but given your involvement with social groupings and young people's development and identity, et cetera, there's so much discourse about what happened on Tuesday and what the future will look like in terms of can we kind of work together as human sapiens or new, I'm not sure what the new word might be. Maybe we'll have to evolve to a new word or discover a new way of implanting something in all of our brains to make us act better. But again, regardless of that, social development is just so important, it seems, in cognitive development. And Yarrow, your lab, again, I'm part of your fan club. I mean, I gotta admit, I'm part of your fan club. It's full disclosure, everybody. There may be other labs, and there are probably other laboratories and academic research centers in the United States dealing with this issue. But I'm partial to what Yarrow and his team at the Social Cognitive Development Yale has accomplished. And to that end, PBS recently had a series of shows, and Yarrow was one of the first people on the show, an episode on public broadcasting on Hack Your Brain. Now that title is kind of really imposing, quite frankly, Yarrow, and I think instills more fear than comfort in people's minds. But on the other hand, it's true. We're at this stage where people are trying to decide where do we go as evolving as a society. So it's for better or for worse. It's keep your eyes open and don't put your head in the sand. So you were on the PBS episode of Hack Your Brain, and you had some young people kind of describe that. We're going to take the next 45 minutes and just talk about the lab, some of the research projects that you are particularly proud of, where the evidence is, and where you might want to go in the future. So there's no particular pressure on you. I don't have a list of questions as I normally do in terms of my interrogation. This would be kind of a conversation about the Social Development Lab at Yale, really, and its import for the world. I mean, I'll be boastful again. I'm your fan club. But talk to us about that episode that was on public broadcast.
Thanks, Tom. It's a pleasure to be back here and to talk to you and talk to all the listeners. Maybe just to come back to that title that you mentioned, I think it's an interesting place to start, this sort of idea of hacking your mind. I mean, one reason why we might like that title is that clearly some of the things we are doing as a culture, as a society, are not working. I mean, the level of polarization, the level of hatred and mistrust, running right through. I mean, even states like Connecticut was about 60-40 in this last election. That's still a lot of our neighbors had very different views than I have, than you have, and so on. And there's a lot of mistrust. And so somehow we are raising generations of children that are buying into this very polarized, very adversarial worldview. And there's a lot going on there. That's a complicated topic. We can't really sit down to any one thing. But a lot of my interest is sort of how do we get there, and how do we see what's the interaction between what you might think of as natural ways that children have of trying to understand the world and all of the kind of rich forms of input they're getting from parents, from neighborhood, from peers, from the media, and so on. So that's just kind of one way to kind of frame that. If what we're doing is not working, we maybe need to come up with some hacks to try to get to a better place, and maybe to try to get out of some ruts in our mental landscape that lead us into this very adversarial, very kind of, us and them kind of thinking. And that's where a lot of my research really focuses on, just how kind of catchy of an idea us and them is, how easy it is for us to start to think about the world in that way.
So walk us through a little bit that episode, because again, you gave a young person, that person maybe three, the young person 3 years old, 4 years old, and you gave them a t-shirt.
That's right.
Had a particular color, and then you asked them something, and so take it from there.
Absolutely, yeah. So what we do now in a big range of our studies with both children and with adults, and it works in a pretty similar way, even with grown-ups like us. But the basic idea is what happens if you find yourself belonging to a group, but you have no history with that group? You don't know anything about that group. You've never encountered it before. It doesn't have any like built-in intrinsic value. It's not like the good group or the bad group. In this case, it might just be the red and the blue group, or the green and the yellow group, or the squares and the circles. So think about the way in which, you know, all the way down to preschool, there might be like classrooms might have different mascots, like the tigers versus the bears. Or we actually do this in kind of regular life with children, and then, or, you know, on the playground, or if we're playing sports, we might break up into teams. Even to do little activities in a professional development seminar, we might decide break into two groups. So we impose this structure on kids. We say, okay, you're going to be in the blue group, or for another kid, you're going to be in the red group. And probably if we think about that at the outset, intuitively, it doesn't seem like that should matter that much. I mean, in some cases, the kid basically knows it's random, and we have a bag full of like colored tokens. We shake it up. We say, choose one. Oh, you chose red. You're going to be in the red group. Why don't you put on this red shirt so you really remember which group you're going to be in? And that's basically the whole experiment, the whole manipulation, as we would say in like psychology lingo. The only thing we've done, the only thing we've manipulated is say, hey, why don't you be in this group? And then what we go on to look at is how does this shift how that child interprets other people, say other children who are also in the red group or the blue group. And what we find really quite strikingly is that that little simple manipulation is enough to get kids to say they like members of their own group more, to share more resources like candy or stickers with members of their own group, and also just to be more positively predisposed in general. So for example, they'll interpret kind of ambiguous events in ways that favor their own group. So imagine someone from my group bumped into someone from your group. I might say, oh, that was clearly accident, while you might say, oh, that looked a little hostile. So kids will interpret the very same action in a very, very different way. And I think here we can see a really clear analog to the real world, where we know that the very same action can look very different depending on the social identity of the person who performs that action, to at least to many observers, and certainly in the domain of race and gender and so on. So we can see the rudiments of that appearing even in this very, very simple and kind of stripped down procedure.
Now, someone who's just heard what you said is going to say that you're making this up, Yarrow. You're saying that a young person, he or she chooses to identify themselves in the red group, just that choice, their knowledge of, first of all, we assume that young people know the difference. They see red, they see green, that they know the difference in colors. Yes. So just the color, just the actual color influences how they might treat people of other that are perceived to be the other in a different color. Right? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Like the mere fact of coming to think of yourself as belonging to a group, even if that group has no real meaning or history, actually shifts our psychology in ways that lead us to favor our own group.
Again, I don't think people will believe that that's true. So
watch the video.
You've been spending your professional life in this area of, we hear the term implicit bias, et cetera, but so what does that tell you? What does your research now tell you of that early formative decision making?
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, the way that I think about this, and the exact interpretation of these findings is still somewhat up for grabs, but the way I think about it is that children, like one of the very basic projects that children have in the social world is to figure out who their people are, who's their tribe, who's their group, the sort of basic sense of who's like me, who can I rely on, who can I count on. But the social world is really, really complicated. We form groups based on all kinds of things. And a lot of the groups that matter in the real world, like, I don't know, nationality, like ethnicity, like religion, even like race, that we might think of as pretty obvious, it's actually kind of complicated. The perceptual cues or the other cues that help you to figure that out, they're complicated and varied. So kids are on the lookout for simple ways to make sense of their social world. And when an adult authority tells them, right now in this context, it matters whether you're in the blue and red group. I mean, that's, I think, only being implicitly communicated, but because we don't say, hey, this is important. We just say, hey, there's a red and a blue group, you're in the red group. But they're taking up from that I should care about this distinction right now. This is a social distinction that matters in my immediate world. And so that's a cue that they're getting from us, but I think it's tapping into a very basic desire that kids and adults have to kind of understand their social place, understand who's like them and who's not like them.
So amplify, and I probably want to come back to that when we conclude, but amplify that or elaborate a little bit more about how that particular research endeavor connects with some of your other research projects that might either contradict or explain further or give it a little different interpretation.
Let's see. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm not sure exactly what you're asking on this.
Well,
one.
I'm asking,
Try that one again. Yeah.
your lab has been involved with how many research projects over the last 5 years?
Yeah, a lot, a lot. I usually have 6 or 8 people in the lab all working on a couple of projects at once. So it's a.
Are you finding are you finding a so-called unified field theory, or are you finding a link?
Right. I wouldn't go that far. Where that's maybe the holy grail, as it were, of understanding how social psychology, intergroup psychology works. But so, I mean, there's a couple things I think to say that are important caveats to what I've said so far that have come out of our work. One is that when we put kids in these 2 groups, they like their own group more. They don't necessarily immediately dislike the other group. So your own group gets a boost, but the other group doesn't necessarily get a downgrade. So it's not that you dislike the red group. They're fine. Red group's fine. They're mildly positive if we're talking about other kids. But your own group gets an advantage, gets a boost. And one idea is that one of the functions that groups play is they create like a social structure. Like who do I tend to cooperate with? I cooperate with family and friends, like-minded people, neighbors, people that I have some kind of social ties for. So it might be the kids are thinking, okay, what you're really telling me is that maybe I'm going to have more opportunities to cooperate with, interact with, befriend my red group. So I'm going to just amp up the positivity associated with that group a little bit. But I don't necessarily dislike the other group. It takes some extra ingredients or some extra steps to get to dislike of the other group.
So I'm going to again. This is I'm only laughing because it's a laugh out of respect, meaning the appreciation as you talk the sobriety of what you're doing, the importance of what you're doing, and not to kind of share falsehoods, because we know that the media is spreading so many falsehoods and don't want to listen to this and run off with to exploit to their particular advantage what you're saying. So I appreciate your sticking to the academic script. I appreciate that. Share with us some of the other than the research projects that you really like, because I don't think people understand the panoply. You mentioned adults and you're working in schools. So I want to kind of freelance and give people an overview of how the deep dive that you're and the serious and consistent and also passionate research that you're involved with.
Yeah, okay, good question. Where to start? I mean, keeping a little bit close to this same theme, one of the things we're definitely interested in, like I basically what I've just been telling you so far is it's really easy to get the kind of seeds of group bias to kind of begin to sprout, right? It's pretty easy to get that going. But we're also really interested in how can we work against that? What are some things that we can do to tamp that tendency down or to work against it, to mitigate against it, however we want to say that. And that seems really important when we think about mapping what we do out of this kind of very controlled situation, out into the world, right? Where we have these problems of intergroup hostilities and, polarization and all of that. And so we have one little set of studies that I like a lot that are kind of in the academic review process now, where what we basically do is we do this, the study starts the same way as I talked to you about before. We put kids into these color-based groups, but then we give them an expectation that either the kind of default expectation is pretty soon on the computer, you're gonna play a little interactive game with someone from your own group. Or in another case, we say, oh, that connection didn't work out. You're gonna play a game with someone from the other group instead. Mm-hmm. And so what is the effect of just knowing, oh, actually, I'm gonna have to interact with someone from the other group, someone from the group I do not belong to. And what we find is that very little simple, just expectation, even before anything happens, even before you see the person or interact with them, that actually reduces some of these biases. That actually makes you more positive about the other group. And one way to think about that is if I know I'm gonna have to interact with you, Tom, like we belong to some of the same groups, some different groups, when I know I'm gonna have to interact with you, I'm predisposed to wanna like you a little more, to wanna make that interaction go smoothly. And what that says to me is like one of the real problems of political polarization is we just don't have that many interactions with people with really different worldviews than us. Mm-hmm. And so it's very easy to stay in our own little bubble and to not have to begin to anticipate what's it going to be like to sit down at the table and have to interact with someone who has different views than me.
So, well, let's jump into schools. I have a slew of questions, but you're working with schools, and I hear you didn't use the word antidotes, but I hear you talking about ways of reversing or really true education for that matter. So let's hear a little about some of that, the solution path that you're kind of carving out.
Right. I mean, now, just to be honest, most of the work we do in schools isn't really it isn't really intervention-based work. It's more like the school is a way for us to get access to our research participants, to children. But one of the things we're really interested in is figuring out figuring out how to make that leap to more intervention-based research, or research really about trying to create positive change. So maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to talk less about my work, but more about some really awesome and fascinating work that came out of the lab of someone at Princeton, a researcher named Betsy Pollock. And she's done these really, I think, amazing and quite labor-intensive studies looking at things like bullying in schools. And one of the principles that she's really put forth is that, and I think this can generalize to thinking about things like racism and other topics. We spend a lot of energy and effort, I think rightly, thinking about how can we change people's minds? How can we make people have more positive attitudes towards people that are different from them? And she sort of argued, yeah, okay, of course, that's a good goal and we should work towards that. But as important is to change the norms that govern how we actually behave to one another. In other words, just to say, whatever you might think in your heart of hearts, it is not okay to discriminate against people on these lines, and you will get socially sanctioned if you do. So you can believe what you want, but your behavior needs to be governed by these kind of common standards of decency, basically. And that's something you can intervene on in very, very different ways by just saying, in our group, in our school, we have a more norm of equal respect, and we listen to what other people say, and we don't bully. And what she basically did is recruited students who were kind of leaders at the school, who were high status kids liked by a lot of others, kids that other kids nominated as they looked up to, and basically got those kids to be ambassadors for these kinds of messages, and basically just say, hey, this is not okay here. And they didn't talk about what you should or shouldn't believe. They just said what you should or shouldn't do, right? And by changing those norms, the behavior in the school over time really, really radically changed in positive ways.
So the impact of community and your
Absolutely.
group of influence.
That's right. And yeah, and just the only thing, the other thing that really strikes me about this now is, for me, one of the huge tragedies of the last 4 years is that same phenomenon, but cutting in the opposite direction, having elected leaders that flouted norms of decency, even if those norms were sometimes a fiction and an illusion in the past. Having leadership that just said, yeah, you can just insult and demean and belittle your political opponents right out there in the open and in front of everyone, right? I think the trickle down effect of that, of normalizing that kind of behavior, and maybe even coming to normalize potentially violence, all kinds of things like that. I think that is one of the great tragedies from my perspective of the Trump years in our country. Only one of them, but one of them nonetheless.
Indeed. It seems to me, just as we're talking now, would be prior to COVID, we were chatting with you and Ashley through the CARE program, and that particular research effort, if memory serves, was taking place in in Hawaii as well as in.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So this was So that was this project is in collaboration with researchers in North Carolina, at someone who was formerly in Seattle at University of Washington, someone at Cal State Long Beach in Southern California, and then in Hawaii as well. So it was a group of 5 of us. And Ashley Jordan, you mentioned, a former graduate student of mine, now a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton. And basically this was really trying to look at early development of children's ideas about race and gender, and really trying to make sure that we included children from both all these different regions, but also from a bunch of different kind of racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that's something that, and unfortunately, psychology has not done a good job, inclusive basically, of working with people, whether adults or children, who represent the actual kind of diversity and kind of of our country, of our region, and so on. So one of our real goals was to sort of not just study what we would call a convenience sample, the easiest people to find and to reach, which, like for me here at Yale, I can study Yale undergraduates pretty easily, and I can get principals at private schools and private preschools to work with me pretty easily, because it's easier for them. They have more resources. One person, a principal, can just say, yeah, let's do it. Well, if I try to get into something like New Haven Public Schools, which is going to have a very different demographic and very different socioeconomic and racial identities present there, it's much harder. It has to go through a whole school board, has to go to a superintendent. It's going to take me months and months of work, and they may say no at the end, right? So for those kinds of reasons, psychology has done a poor job, I think, really reflecting who our country actually consists of. And this is one of our goals here, to really look at how do kids from diverse economic, racial, and regional backgrounds think about race and gender, really in the kind of formative preschool years of around ages 4 to 6.
I know but at the research still, I know this is still, we're still in the preliminary stages, but are you at a point to mention a little bit of the results thus far, or the observations thus far?
So actually, I can't really start talking about results yet, because we've literally like just wrapped up data collection. Basically, we actually ended a little bit early because of COVID, because of our inability to kind of complete the project in the originally intended way as everything went into lockdown. But we have now finished data collection and are involved in this complicated sort of insider process of doing all the data cleaning, merging the data across all of these sites and getting that together. But I think within the next few months, maybe this can be my next visit, we could talk about results, because we're actually, we're right getting into getting the results, the data into a format that we can start to look at it and start to analyze it.
If you have time to do that in the next few months, that would be tremendous, because I really feel, as you've mentioned, we could have had this. The lab started when, in 2004? When did you?
I came to Yale in about 2013, I believe.
So it's so relatively new, but we could have had this discussion last year, the year before, separate from who's in the White House. But it's certainly, I think, the consumer interest about can we all get along, as Rodney King would say, is on our implicit or explicit minds. When I have looked at the website, it seems almost every 4 or 5 months there's something up there about you collaborating with an article, and that you're publishing an article with somebody else and somebody else and somebody else. Tell me a little bit about that in terms of what's been driving you in terms of your particular research.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So one of the newer directions that I'm really interested in and excited about is really thinking about, one of the ways we think about it is children's understanding of sort of social institutions. So how do children think about things like money, like what makes money money? How does the power of money get fixed? But also the power of a judge or a police officer to say, make an arrest or hand down a sentence. These are kind of odd things if we think about it, because they're immensely impactful and powerful. They have huge impact on our lives and our society, but it's a little bit mysterious how they work. It sort of works because we all decide that this will work. We all decide as a kind of the social fiction of us all going along with the idea that I can hand you a piece of paper and you will give me whatever, a sandwich or whatever it is. That works because we've all decided it works. And this is a kind of a complicated thing that also relates to questions of political legitimacy and so on. And so we're really interested in how kids come to understand those aspects of their social world, like things like judges and police officers and presidents, and money and identification cards, which are really different than things like hammers, or the doctor can maybe stitch up a wound no matter what anyone says about that doctor. But a president can, as we're just about to see, lose their ability to do all of these impactful things like sign a bill into law. So this is a very different sort of world of these kind of institutional or socially constructed or political ways. Indeed.
I'm not sure if there's a guy named Charles Eisenstein. Have you heard of him?
I just know his name, but yeah, tell me more.
He's been sharing a lot about the same topic. And then Yuval Harari, he has a book on.
Yes. The guy who wrote *Sapiens*, and
he also is.
Yeah, I'm a fan of that book. Yeah, very much. Yeah, very related to some of those ideas.
It seems to be in the academic parlance, and I think it's really true about how do we subconsciously give our power and not even knowing that we're giving it away.
That's right. Yeah, and that can be right. It's a force of both good and can be a force of ill as well. And it can go off the rails a little bit. But yeah, but also, and thinking about how can we structure children's learning so that they want to become engaged citizens, that they want to become participants in political processes, even though it can obviously often be alienating or confusing or challenging to be involved.
You're probably bored with this question, but I have to ask. I shouldn't say I have to ask it, but the phrase implicit bias and explicit bias. You have some familiarity with the origins of that research, and also the continued controversy about its the applicability. Would you care to comment? And again, I don't mean to bore you with the responses you probably
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, just the background is that one of my main kind of advisors and mentors when I was a graduate student is a woman, Mahzarin Banaji, who's very closely associated with implicit bias and this one particular measure of implicit bias called the implicit association test. And so a lot of my early research was looking at how children acquire these implicit forms of bias. And by implicit, we often mean, not your kind of consciously held or ideological position, but these subtler biases you might have that we can think of, just subtle reactions you might have when you see someone that's different from you, a little bit of negativity, a little bit of fear, a little bit of a sense of a threat that, for example, I believe and would argue that many white Americans feel when they encounter, say, African Americans, for example. Not in all contexts, in all cases, and not all people, but it feeds into some of the kinds of microaggression sort of talk and things like that. And as you pointed out, this has been somewhat controversial, sometimes for reasons about how important is implicit bias versus explicit bias. And this is something my own thinking has changed on a little bit. I mean, I think when I was doing this research in the sort of early 2000s, I was a little more optimistic, I guess, about the status of explicit bias in this country. And maybe if we want to talk about race, about the degree of an extent of explicit racism. I was sort of like, okay, that's getting a lot better, definitely not solved, but getting a lot better. And maybe now a lot of the action, as it were, a lot of the problems might be these subtler forms of bias. For me, one of the other eye-opening things about the last 4 years is the rise of much more explicit forms of bias, much more explicit forms of racism. And so my own thinking has shifted a little bit towards thinking we still really have a big problem with explicit forms of prejudice that we need to tackle as well. But I don't think it's either or. I think the human mind is complex. And we have all kinds of, if you just introspect on your own life walking through the world, we have all kinds of subtle little reactions when we encounter others. And other people can sometimes pick up on that. And that can have, if you're someone from a category, if you belong to a group that faces negative reactions, even in these small, subtle ways, again and again and again over the course of your life, that's consequential, that's weighty. So for me, I see us as needing to talk about and address both, but maybe my views of the balance between the two have shifted a little bit based on recent events.
Well, as we know, the current president received more, as you're aware, he's received more votes than any other president or presidential nominee in the history of this American experiment, except for Biden.
That's right.
He received more votes than Barack. He received more votes than Hillary, and almost 7 million more votes he received this time than in 2016. So it is a fascinating thing. Is it fair for me to ask you about, again, there's a popular phrase in the last 2 years or so in terms of this phrase, anti-racism training.
Yeah.
Is it fair to ask you your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's a complicated issue. And so one of the challenges is that the empirical evidence that the actual, say, sensitivity trainings or anti-racist trainings or the empirical evidence that these do a good job actually changing people's minds is just not that good. So it's not clear that the trainings are doing a lot of good in general. Now, that's when you sum across tons and tons of programs, tons of facilitators, tons of approaches. And I would assume that some people are really good at this and some audiences are more receptive to it. And so it's a big, complicated kind of a mess of the actual data. And it suggests that it's not always terribly effective. So whether we should be devoting huge amounts of money to it is, I think, a complicated question because of that, because the efficacy is just sort of not that well established, and we don't really know how best to do it. From my perspective, though, I sort of start from the framework that we still do have a major problem with race. That we still have a racism problem in this country, and therefore we need to be figuring out what to do and how to improve that. And so I'm open to us. I think we need to be doing more of the empirical work to figure out what are the best ways to change minds. It comes back to something we were talking about before. Change minds versus change standards of conduct. How should we do this? And I think there are a lot of open questions there. But feel free to follow up or push me a little bit on any of that.
I'll save it for your next show. But I might come back. We have another 20 minutes or so. I apologize if it appears I'm going kind of scattershot, but just there's so much I'm trying to kind of paint the landscape for folks. Many of your papers and research, and when you mentioned America, many of your papers and research endeavors, they've been in other countries.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important, I think, for people to know that this is you're looking at humanity under these nationalistic titles, nationalistic groupings, and still finding some interesting results.
Yeah, that's right. So right, by now we've done research in Japan, China, Taiwan, South Africa, Brazil, the United Kingdom, Germany, starting some other projects in other countries as well, India. And there's a few things, like the few kind of goals there. One is that I mentioned before how psychology has had this problem of focusing on these kind of convenient samples, which have generally been, white kind of middle class participants. And then the data from those participants gets used to make these kind of universal claims about human psychology. There's now, I think, I'm very convinced that that's a problem, that we can't use that group of people, even if I may be a member of that group myself, we can't use that group as a stand-in for humanity and for like what's universal about human psychology. And a really kind of clever critique of this came out of a paper now a decade or so back that was called, I think it was called Weird Psychology or Weird Science, where weird is an acronym standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic. And it's saying that group of people has been used as the baseline for what humans are like. But if we think about human history, that's a really small piece of the pie, right? And so for me, a lot of it, when I find what looks like a common pattern emerging in the children or adults that I study here, one of the first questions for me is, can I have any confidence in this being something about the human mind in general, or is this something about Yale students, right? For example, if my study is done with a sample of students who took Introduction to Psychology that particular semester, right? How confident am I that that group is representative? So that's one of the real goals of doing sort of similar pieces of work across these different countries. And then similarly, there's a lot of research, I've done research on, say, how North American children think about race. Well, race is not unique to North America, or maybe in some ways it's unique, but in some ways not. So what happens when you look at how children think about race in South Africa or Brazil, right? Countries that from a very superficial viewpoint, you might say, oh, there's some kind of white-black dynamic going on, but it's clearly very differently constructed in many ways. And often there are other kind of categories that look very different. So the goal there is really just to make sure we're talking about something that's hopefully a little more reflective of kind of general principles of how the mind works, or not, and that we know which one it is, right?
Well, tease us a little bit. What if you're able or willing, in terms of some of how do people in South Africa or Brazil or Taiwan see race, or tease us a little bit with some of the research some of the evidence you've uncovered.
Yeah, so in both Brazil and South Africa, the evidence that we've gotten so far, suggest, and like if we think about the example of South Africa, this will maybe be intuitive to people, that the sort of intensity of the kind of racial hierarchy is even stronger in, say, South Africa than here. And one of the ways that manifests itself
in the last 5 years.
Our research now, let's see, the papers from South Africa were published somewhere around 2014, which probably means we collected that data a couple of years before that. So this might be a little outdated now. But what we did find there is really, some evidence that of really some kind of, I think, disheartening sort of phenomena that we might think of as something like the internalization of stigma or the internalization of social status, where Black children in South Africa tend to have that we tested anyway, and some of these kids were tested in sort of townships outside of Johannesburg. And so, overwhelmingly Black environments without a lot of contact and connection with white South Africans because of the nature of school segregation that they experience and so on, but have pretty negative attitudes and perceptions of their own kind of racial group, and fairly positive or rosy attitudes towards, say, white kids. And we can see some versions of that in the United States, but much less starkly than we saw there.
Certainly in the Caribbean and in South Africa, people often wonder about why these creams to make your color lighter are so popular, even still as we speak. Right, someone right now, this particular moment in South Africa, the Caribbean, elsewhere, India, if they're dark skinned, are buying some creams to lighten their skin. Something just as consumer effort, just as simple as that. in spite of the
right.
effect. Um,
Yeah.
uh, let's shift. I want to keep on the international issue for a while, because I put on Facebook about a month ago, that people in China haven't really voted for a free election in 20 years. People in Russia haven't voted in a free election in about 25 to 30 years.
Right.
We're kind of the exception. You can debate whether we have free elections here, but when you look at the world, there's only maybe 20%, 30% of the countries that have even some semblance of free elections. So my point is, in terms of people being conditioned by their more dominant groups, cultural and mores, that this whole issue of democracy is really in the minority in terms of people. People are being conditioned in China and China might become the world dominant player, or some might say it already is. So I'm just curious of how you see the impact of political systems on people's behavior.
Right. It's a great question. For me, one of the really challenging things, right, and this is the sort of critics of democracy going all the way back to basically the ancient Greeks. Like the big worry was, the problem with democracy is that sometimes people make bad decisions or don't make decisions in their own interests, especially when they're in the sway of sort of a powerful demagogue, someone who's at least thought by some to be charismatic and who can sort of rally people to their cause, right? So sort of challenging issues, and you put that together with lots of systematic patterns of kind of disenfranchisement and so on, putting up barriers to participation in the election. So, parts of me are worried about, I guess that's partly me just reminding myself that the extent to which we have free elections is something that, it's nowhere near where I think many of us would want it to be. At the same time, it's the best vision we have of how to do this. And I think one of the questions that I really have is about, I think there are features of a two-party winner-take-all system, though, that I worry about. And if we come back to all the way back to the red and the blue group, like the easier it is for us to think about our political reality as a tribal, two teams fighting in a zero-sum context for supremacy, the more that psychology gets activated, and the more we're going to start to see the other side as our enemy. And not that there's no reason to think of them as enemies. That's partly the issue, right? Those reasons really get a lot of weight and really can amp up this sort of competitive, all or nothing kind of us and them psychology, right? So I think that's one of the big challenges we have to figure out within the confines of our democratic system. Are there alternatives? Is there a possibility of third parties or of other forms of representative election, or are we stuck with this system?
Yeah, I guess, or rank order, or just one man, one vote.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you referenced the initial red and blue T-shirt. Is it again, a lot of my questions are just from a base. I try to be I am the basic man on the street. So
Yeah. Love it.
Involved with media, blah, 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 blah. I'm a blogger. But for me, when I hear the term red state, blue state, to me, it's a reference to, of course, the blue and the gray, but is even the acceptance of, when you see the maps of red state, blue state, does that help does that reinforce, simulate, confirm our division? Does it help? Is it a negative thing when we have this paradigm of red states and blue states?
I mean, I definitely think it feeds into that for sure. It feeds into an us and them kind of mentality and a kind of a tribal mentality. And from my perspective, a lot of what's going on in our country and a lot of what's happened in recent years is that tribalism kind of taking over, right? And so where it becomes, and you can see some of this on the, anyway, where you get to this context where the positions that you have to hold to be a sort of a good member of your community get very scripted. And so now we have one side, from my perspective, that is largely given up on trying to be evidence-based. So if we just think about response to the pandemic as just one case study, this has unfortunately become a partisan issue where one side is aligned with scientific best practices and one side is not. And you're sort of stuck. If you're a member of that other tribe, the social costs to you of going across the aisle, as it were, are greater than to use an overly fancy word, than the like epistemic value of getting it right, than the kind of having the view that corresponds with science. That probably has some value, but the cost of going against your community is much greater. The cost could be people stop liking you, stop interacting with you. People, your neighbors, your friends, your church, your whatever, right? And so I think the tribalism has taken over for an effort to sort of find out what's true or what's right to a large degree.
And has your research reinforced that that's a force, that's a predilection that we have to try to reverse or move on, or does your research give some hope that we can not become so tribal?
I mean, maybe little glimmers of hope along the lines of things I talked about before, where if we create the expectation that you're going to actually have a nice social interaction with someone, that can smooth over some of that can kind of tamp that down a little bit. But we also find that some of these sort of what you might think of as a kind of early forms of kind of partisanship or polarization are present in preschool age children, where they, for example,
3-year-old, 4-year-olds.
So yeah, at least 4, 5, 6, by that range, for example, children will prefer and they'll seek out information that sort of supports and bolsters the things they already believe about their own group, right? So if they like their own group, as most of them do, they don't really want to be exposed to things that might paint their own group in a negative light, and they're going to seek out and share with others things that paint their group in a positive light. So that basic sense of wanting to sort information and find information that favors your own group, almost like a little filter bubble or something like we might think of, is present pretty early. And you can think about that as part of the wheel that just kind of spins forward and kind of reinforces some of these initial tendencies.
So speaking of this wheel that's reinforcing tendencies, and you've been kind of clear that I think one can kind of guess about who you voted for last week. But are you also saying that Trump wannabes are being formed? There are 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds that are on the path to replicating, imitating, demonstrating Trump tendencies 20 years from now, 30 years from now, as they get into political office?
I think so. I think that, I mean, the worry is that the, generation of people who supported those views and those policies and that person now are raising a generation of kids as well.
They're raising kids. They have a family.
Those kids are being, I mean, as are my child is being, at an abstract level, this is happening no matter what side of the political aisle you are. Like I have a 4.5-year-old and I am working hard to incorporate, I want her to adopt a certain set of values that I share, just like someone who has very different views than me is, right? So I don't want to make it sound like one side is all ideology and one side is all truth. On the other hand, I do think some values are better than others and lead to a more harmonious society, a more inclusive society that allows a broader range of people to live out their own vision for the good life, right? And so, so that is the worry. And the question is, how can we break that cycle of just sort of the perpetuation of the divisions that are there today?
Let's jump in about another 10 minutes. And again, you've already publicly committed to coming back. So I have it not only on record, I have it on visual record and audio record. And so just keep that in mind. Talk to me about some of your undergrad and graduate students. What's keeping them alive? What kind of research interests they have? Have you noticed, because you've been teaching for a while, what do you see in the younger upstarts that are committed to making this world a better place through psychology?
Yeah, it's been actually, even just over the last, starting with all the sort of the protest movement of the summer, Black Lives Matter, the aftermath of George Floyd and so on. One thing that I've been very impressed with and inspired by is the real desire to make a difference on those issues and be out there on those issues of the graduate students. They're much more inclined in that direction in general than the faculty are. And they're the ones exerting pressure on, for example, our department, my department, the psychology department here at Yale, and we've committed, very much at their urging, formed a new committee for racial equity and justice, which is thinking deeply about things like how is our department related to the broader New Haven community? How has our department thought about and confronted some of the really, really, really terrible legacies of fields like psychology that have in the past been involved with things like, institutionalized racism of many forms of there are a lot, if we go back to things like phrenology saying that, based on the color of your skin and the shape of your head and this and that and the other, you're not as intelligent. Those were psychologists. Those were, of course, not colleagues that I've ever actually had as my colleagues, but those were people who were in departments like my department, and how do we confront and work against that history? I'm coming back to your question about how do we make sure we are an anti-racist department and part of an anti-racist movement rather than just trying to be like, no, we're just objective scientists, which has always been, the first move of scientists, even if they were in fact involved in what we would now look back on and say was blatantly racist and racially motivated research. So it's been inspiring to see students really taking up that charge, putting pressure on us, making noise about it. And that's still a work in process, but it's gotten me more active because I want to be, because of the inspiration of the younger people, the next generation who want to be out on the front lines.
That's great. Just as you were talking, my mind went to that President Solvay has asked David Blight and others to kind of come up with a task force and research project on Yale's involvement with slavery, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Really interesting. As a layperson's question, you hear this word. Actually, it's been ebbs and flow in my mind over the last 30 years, cognitive dissonance. Even you hear that word, we all think that we're psychologists. Let's make that clear, right? We all think we know what we know, and we know what we know. But your reaction is that too much of a general term to apply to the 70+ million people voting for 145th this time in terms of the impact of cognitive dissonance?
I mean, right. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because as you said, cognitive dissonance gets used in a variety of ways, but I certainly think it has a part. I mean, I think so one of the classic ideas about cognitive dissonance is that if we engage in a particular kind of action, once we've done that action, we can't change the fact that we did that action. But what we can change is how we think about it or how we feel about it. And so we'll often adjust our beliefs to make ourselves feel okay about the actions that we've engaged in, right? So that's kind of one of the really classic forms of cognitive dissonance. And I know the term gets used in broader ways, but for example, once someone has voted for a particular political candidate, it's cognitively, emotionally, psychologically, it's a little bit hard to change your mind. It's a little bit hard to say, I got it wrong. This person was not who I thought they were, what I thought they were, didn't stand for the things I thought they did. It's a little easier to shift what you believe a little bit in the direction of that person so that you can stay consistent, right? One of the ideas of cognitive dissonance is we're motivated to be consistent. No one likes to be a hypocrite. No one likes to be called out and told that, wait, hey, you just said this, but you told me this other thing yesterday, right? That's aversive. We don't like that. And so we'll sometimes change what we believe to get out of feeling that way. And that can have negative or positive consequences. But in some of these cases, I think it can lead us to stick with positions we've taken in the past, even if maybe our best self would revise our views.
Right. So the 70 million people that recently voted are inspired to stick to their guns 4 years from now.
Well, and in that sense, right, hopefully, right, the upsurge of, I think, really positive forms of activism, one hope is that taking part in that could potentially be a very positive form of cognitive dissonance and creating a bigger cohort of people who think that's how you're supposed to be, and that's what I'm going to do again. I will take to the streets again if we have to, and so on. Right?
Great. Any as we've talked over the last 45 or so minutes, any thoughts that have come up to you that you want to kind of share or insights?
No, I don't think so. I think we've hit on a lot of the big picture topics, and it's been really fun.
I still have a list of 30 other questions here. One of our first shows talked about, are you still involved with the Humanism Society?
Yeah, I haven't actually been that involved with them recently, but not out of any, just out of busyness. And I think our first visit, I don't think I wasn't a parent yet, so everything's just gotten a little more busy, a little more impacted. But there's still, I guess, so sometimes on the holidays, they're a little active around kind of trying to figure out ways to come together as a community and celebrate without having to be explicitly involved in a sort of a traditional religious framing.
Indeed. So my question is to you, why did you probably had your choice of several religious backgrounds, if you so chose, but you aligned yourself somewhat with the humanism. I'm just curious about that choice. Yeah. And what does that say about is there that human need for, regardless of whether you want to wear the Baptist red shirt or the Presbyterian green shirt or the humanist pink shirt, is that kind of a natural tendency in your part to want to?
I think so. I mean, certainly it has a function. It's a function in part of where I grew up as well. I mean, I wasn't raised particularly religiously. Grew up in Berkeley, California, in the 70s and 80s, where it's pretty left and pretty and not a particularly religious place. But at the same time, for me, I think basically, when I was first learning about the incredible diversity of religious traditions and religious beliefs, all of which, or the vast majority of which, claim to have a handle on objective truth and who the true God is and what that God really thinks and believes, I looked at that and just said, okay, clearly from my perspective, this is just a lot of stories that people have come up with, and that's fine. Stories are great, they're powerful, but for me to decide the moral principles that I'm going to support based on that just felt a little shaky to me. I feel like from my perspective, I want my moral principles to be grounded in human reasoning, human thought, human knowledge, what we can come together and agree on, not what some particular group of people at some particular point in time wrote in a book, basically, to kind of boil it down. Doesn't mean we can't take inspiration and knowledge from lots of traditions, and I certainly do myself.
You mentioned the word morals and morality, and again, 20, 30 years ago, Kohlberg was the moral scale kind of thing. Is that still prevalent, or has it mutated, or does it connect with your work at all about?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and this might have to be another topic too. But yeah, I do have one of the lines of research in my lab is, in a sense, about moral development, especially how kids think about fairness and cooperation and sharing and generosity and things like that. And those certainly goes back to those principles. I would say one of the big shifts from Kohlberg was very interested in the kind of explicit principles that children or adults can learn to articulate. And a lot of the big shift, almost going back to that explicit, implicit bias kind of idea, is that a lot of our moral reactions are much more like down here in our gut. It's like, that just feels wrong to me. And the way in which we then justify or explain that is sometimes something we do after the fact. It's not always what actually drove the judgment. The judgment sometimes comes first. And this is why moral progress can be hard, right? Like deciding that we need to extend the moral circle to, our of different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations. The reason that can be hard is some people initially have an intuitive kind of moral aversive reaction to that has to be overcome. And we have to figure out how to kind of get to those more principles.
If you hear that music, there's a reason that Harry's playing it, because he's going to kick us off.
Shut up.
I want to mention the word Ernest Becker to you. I've been reading more of his work about death and the fear of death, and the next discussion I'd like to include that. But I think that's what you get in also, that the fear of death, this with COVID, and et cetera, has exacerbated our fears big time.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, thank you so much, Yarrow Dunham, the director of the Social Cognitive Development Lab at Yale. It's been a pleasure as always. You keep on growing the hair. We're going to try again. Again, just deep thanks, and definitely let's give a shout out to your grad students and all of your colleagues worldwide. You guys are on a path for making this a better place, and I really appreciate that.
Hey, my pleasure. I always appreciate it, Tom. Love the questions. Look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, well, thanks again, man. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Early 2021. January.
Cause this is my road. Let's camera action, I'm ready to go.
This is Harry Grove, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM New Haven.